Rotating is going to be an excellent way to develop power. Putting our body on stretch, understanding that opposite shoulder is going to connect to opposite hip, we're going to want to utilize this, and by rotating, we're going to utilize that stretch. Two of the movements that we're going to do in this series are going to be the chest pass, one-arm rotational throw, and an overhead throw rotational as well. We're going to start with that chest pass. As we can see, JP is set up in what we would call a perpendicular setup. If we think about the wall as one plane, and then we think about the setup of his feet as another plane, if we drew a line from toe to toe, he'd be set up perpendicularly. When we get into parallel throws a little bit later, he'd square himself up to the wall, so this allows for us to be able to build that categorization in our programs and build balance. Key points here. First thing, he's going to load those hips. Again, that ball is tight, high, right on his chest, and then as he extends his hips, he's going to rotate, being patient, and then firing the ball at that wall. Key points here, rapid explosive movement to extend those hips while he rotates. We want complete extension. We want to make sure that he's patient, waiting to explode with that upper body only at the end of that extension, putting it all together. Another way that we can execute a rotational movement is going to be an overhead throw. So if we're thinking about how we would train a particular sport, this first movement would be great for training for baseball, if we wanted to use that as a reference. Again, when we think about sport-specific training, we think movement-specific, not necessarily putting a bat in his hand. The next movement we're going to show is the overhead rotational throw. This is just another way that we could show how we kinetically link. The lever arm is going to be a little bit longer because JP's arms are going to be really long to whip through, but none of the coaching points really change. We're still thinking about loading those hips, using that ground reaction force, being patient as we extend, and then whipping through at the end. JP, overhead rotational throw. We can't stress patience enough. We can't stress focusing on that deceleration enough. Again, you could see that as much power as he's putting into this throw, he's still focusing on how he controls his body through the entire movement. Two main points that we definitely want to focus on. Give us another rep. And that's how we execute the chest pass and overhead rotational throws. When we're utilizing the wall for med ball rotational throws, there are two types of orientation that we can have. One type is going to be perpendicular. That's essentially when we're not facing the wall. Another type is going to be parallel, and that's when we're going to be facing the wall. And that's the kind of orientation that we're going to focus on in this series. A couple of things that we want to think about in terms of executing these rotational movements. First thing is going to be hand placement. We want to be able to focus on where our hands are. In a couple, we think about punching the ball. In this particular case, we're going to think about it as if we were scooping water. So there's going to be one hand underneath the ball, one hand behind the ball. This is going to help JP receive the ball in a cleaner fashion so we can focus on that reactivity, especially because we're utilizing a reactive ball. The next thing that we want to focus on is how he's rotating. If we were to imagine that there was a line that went through the top of his head down to the ground, he's essentially going to be rotating around that line or rotating around that axis. So when he gets into either this kneeling position or this standing position, his feet and his knees are going to be fixed, but it doesn't mean that he's not going to be utilizing his hips. He's still going to be utilizing his hips, rotating through his torso around that axis. Hip action. We want those hips to be snappy. If they're going to contribute, they better contribute the way we want them to, which means they've got to be violent in their extension, but then also violent in their deceleration. They've got to contribute the way we want them to, initiating the action, contributing to the action, and then also braking to help aid in the action. JP's going to get set up now in the kneeling parallel rotational throw position. JP already knows the spot on the wall that he wants to utilize, so that ball is going to hit that spot the entire time. It's not going to fly all over the place. He's going to be very accurate with his throws to help him aid in executing these movements. Give us a couple. As we can see, those hips are extremely violent. They decelerate at the top, but then he anticipates the reaction force and they get ready to eccentrically load to absorb that force. Again, eccentric strength is going to be very important in terms of injury prevention. His hips are helping him aid in reducing that force and then helping him redirect that force to be able to throw that ball back at the wall. We're going to take this up a notch. Just by taking him to his feet is going to be a progression. Why? Because the lever arm is going to be longer, which means that he's going to be able to generate more force. JP's going to stand on up for us, and now he's going to give us a couple of standing parallel rotational throws. Before he gets there, Remember, we're thinking about the hips as a set of headlights. So when he loads, he's going to rotate just a little bit, but then he's going to snap those headlights back to center so that they should be facing the wall. What's happening at the hips is crucially important. A couple of standing parallel rotational throws. As you can see, nothing has really changed. The movement is exactly the same between kneeling and standing. The only difference is he's on his feet and there's a longer lever arm. But we're still focusing on the same things. Hand position, rotating around that axis, the hips violently contributing to the action. We want to make sure that those hips are snapping forward, decelerating, and then preparing him to decelerate once the ball comes back, working on that eccentric strength. This is how we execute the kneeling and standing parallel rotational throws. Rotational throws, a great way to utilize kinetic linking to be able to apply complete force and power into our med ball throws while using the wall. Again, we want to focus on reaction, we want to be able to focus on rehearsal of movements, and we want to focus on kinetic linking. There are a couple of progressions that we can do. First progression, the type of ball we're going to use. Understanding that if we're going to use a dead ball, we're not worrying about reaction, so that would be the first step in focusing on kinetic linking without them having to worry about the ball coming back at them. We're going to jump along. JP's ready for it, so we're going to go right to using that reactive ball. Progression in terms of from kneeling to standing or split position, your position is also going to be a progression. Why? Because whether you utilize all that force from the feet or if you're in a kneeling position, the lever is going to influence the amount of kinetic linking that you're going to get. It's not going to take it out of the equation, but it's just going to help us build in terms of how we utilize that length to contribute to our power. So as JP gets into this kneeling position, this will be the first progression of this throw. Again, if I were to take a string and tie from big toe to big toe, that would create one line. The wall creates another line. That's our perpendicular setup, and that's how we know what our category is. If he were to turn, it'd be parallel. So now we know his setup. Nothing's going to change here as far as the kinetic linking is concerned. So because he's on his knees, that doesn't mean that he's taking his lower body out of the equation. He's still going to load his hips, and his hips are still going to be the initiator of this motion. So it's still kinetic linking. He doesn't have to be on his feet for it to be kinetic linking. It's just about how he's going to transfer that force from his lower body up through his torso, out through his upper body to be able to put it all together. JP, give us a couple of perpendicular rotational throws. As you can see here, JP is aggressively extending his hips. Again, because he's on his knees, it doesn't mean that his hips are not contributing. They are actually major drivers of this action. So, because he's on his knees doesn't mean that he's not kinetic linking. Also, you can notice that he initiates this movement with his hips. The next thing, you can see how he was utilizing the reaction of the ball to load himself. He's focusing on eccentric strength. That eccentric strength, the ability to handle eccentric forces, are going to be huge in injury prevention. Even though he was eccentrically loading as he received that ball, he never lost his posture. His torso was straight and upright the entire time. His head was in neutral. He was timing how he was receiving those forces to be able to utilize them, not just break him down. This is going to be extremely important when we think about how we can utilize these movements, not only for performance enhancement, but for injury prevention. They're going to be critical for those. A progression, get him up on his feet. We want to increase that lever arm now, right? Now, he's really going to be able to load. He's really going to be able to use that ground reaction force from his foot all the way up out through his fingertips while he rotates. JP, give us a couple of standing perpendicular rotational throws. Couple of key things that you see that JP's doing really well. Where that ball is going. You can see that as he rotates, he's got to focus on where he wants that ball to hit, and it's directly in line from where his hip is. This is really important because the succession is going to allow him to really focus on developing this movement. If he were throwing that ball all over the place, it would interrupt his ability to actually produce that force that we're looking for. So again, not creating this arc, but that straight line, that shortest distance between point A and point B, going to be supremely important. Another thing that you noticed, just by going to his feet, he was able to produce a lot more power. So that lever arm is going to be completely important, supremely important. It also means that when he wanted to decelerate, he was handling a lot more forces as well. So thinking about standing, kneeling, or in a split position is going to be really important, not only in the amount of power that you produce, but the amount of force that you're going to have to reduce in injury prevention. This is how we execute the kneeling and standing perpendicular rotational throws.